Hello and welcome to the CEO Show. This is your host, Nick Vaidya, with a very special guest today, Dr. Deepak Malhotra. He was recently recognized among the world's best business school professors, 40 under 40. And he is the Eli Goldston Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. Deepak has won numerous awards for teaching and research and has the distinction of delivering end-of-the-year speeches to graduating MBA students. His work is focused on negotiations and deal making, and he has received worldwide recognition as an advisor to business and political leaders globally, from armed conflicts to boardrooms. We're going to go in depth with Deepak on his thinking and experiences, so let us see what we can learn today.
And the question is, what are they supposed to do now? And all of their friends have more or less abandoned them in this negotiation. And the way in which this protagonist ended up solving the problem and resolving the conflict was actually by sitting down with the people that had just sued him, had refused to talk to him, had taken him to court, had just won, and somehow managed to negotiate a deal with them that not only allowed him not to pay a few $1,000,000 to them, but actually make a few $1,000,000 in a renewed relationship with this party. And I explain how they went about doing it, and one of the principles I bring up there is something I actually learned from my martial arts instructor. Anytime we were in class and somebody asked a question like, well, what if your opponent does this? Or what if your opponent is bigger? Or what if they grab you from here? The instructor would stop and say, partners, not opponents. And then he would go on to say, listen, the people in this dojo, even those who are attacking you, are trying to teach you something. How are you going to learn from someone if you think of them as your opponents, not your partners? And then sometimes you'd go on to say, even the person on the street who's attacking you is not your opponent, they're your partner. Because if you don't think about them that way, you're not going to be thinking clearly, you're not going to stay calm, you're not going to think about ways that can resolve the issue without it getting to blows or without, resorting to violence. And I think the same mentality is relevant in negotiations. And so when I have clients, when I have students, when I'm advising on a deal, and the frame of adversary or opponent or enemy starts setting in, I tell people, listen, you have to stop doing that. You have to think about them as your partners, because otherwise all of your incorrect instincts will rise to the surface. And the only set of tactics and options you're going to think about are going to be more adversarial and much more competitive. And those might be relevant, but those shouldn't be the only things we're thinking about.
Right. I think it's a mindset, and the mindsets are very important, because this is not a conceptually learned, I don't want to call it art or science, but this is an experiential learning rather than a cognitive learning thing. You need to know, and so mindset will drive your behaviors.
Right.
So then my next question is, of course, you need to reframe your own thinking. But how to reframe somebody else's thinking, and that seems to be a hard thing, specifically when egos are involved, pressures are involved, and your partner, if I may say, is actually not even coming to the table. So you are frustrated. You're saying, well, I understand this is how it is supposed to be, but how do I communicate to this other person who is acting adversarial?
Yeah. So I'll give you an example. So imagine you're in a negotiation, and let's take the kind of negotiation you've just mentioned, one that has gotten to be very adversarial, where maybe there's a lot of emotion in the room. Maybe people are, behaving in ways that you think are unethical, or at the very least, they're out to get you. If you're in a negotiation and the other side starts losing their cool or starts getting angry or starts calling you names, the most common reaction people have is either to fight back and get angry themselves, or to say something like, hey, listen, you know what, there's no room for anger in this situation. If you're going to be losing your cool, this conversation is over. What people often fail to do in those scenarios, understandably, is really step back and try to understand the perspective of the other side. Why is this person angry? Why is this person being aggressive at this moment in this negotiation with me? And the reason I encourage people to do that, even when the person is sitting there calling you names or calling your mom names, is because all different kinds of anger can look the same, but all different kinds of angers don't have the same solution. You need to understand what exactly is driving this person to behave in the way they're behaving. If they're angry, for example, because they think that the offer you've made is entirely one-sided, then the solution might be to help them realize or help them understand why and where there's value for them in the deal. If they're angry because they think you've disrespected them, well, then the question is, how can you change the conversation in a way that shows some more respect? If they're angry simply because they got into a fight with their spouse in the morning and now they're just taking it out on you, well, then you have a different solution. Maybe let's not talk about it now. Let's talk about it at another point in time. And so if you think about how you're going to reframe the scenario, how you're going to reframe what you're proposing, or how you're going to reframe this negotiation to the other side, the first step is understanding them. How are they seeing the situation, and precisely why? What is standing in the way of them seeing this in a less adversarial way? What is standing in the way of them seeing this as less of a zero-sum game? And throughout the negotiation book, in Negotiating the Impossible, I give many examples of how people who were in litigation, people who were in a tough business deal, sports conflicts, in war and peace situations, one of the tools that has been at people's disposal is to allow the other side to see the situation in a different way, whether it's reframing the offer they've made or reframing the negotiation itself, that allows them to back down from their aggressive position. In fact, the very first story I tell in the book, in the very introduction of the book, is a story about the oldest peace treaty that we know of in history. And what's fascinating about this peace treaty is that it was written about in 1300 BC. It was between the Egyptians and the Hittites. And one of the things that's interesting is that when you read the peace treaty, you can read it in one of two languages. You can read it in hieroglyphics, which was the Egyptian version, or you can read it in Akkadian, which was the Hittite version. And when you read these two peace treaties, they're basically the same, as they should be. And they have a lot of the same features we would see in peace treaties in the centuries and millennia to follow. But there's one other feature in these peace treaties that is actually something relevant even today. When you compare the two versions of the peace treaty, although everything else is basically the same, there's one obvious difference. And the difference is this. In the Egyptian version, it says it was the Hittites who came asking for peace. And it's in the Hittite version that the Egyptians were the ones who came begging for peace. And what you discover is in this ancient text, written over 3,000 years ago, one principle was still the same as it is today in every kind of conflict you're going to find yourself in. The need for each side to be able to declare victory to their own side is crucial. The need for each side to be able to walk away saying, we didn't lose, or to save face is crucial. And that's basically what you're doing in many negotiations where people have gotten to the point where they have entrenched positions, they're not willing to back down, even though you're sure that the direction they're going is not the right one. Even when you're convinced that the way they're behaving is bad not just for you, but for them. And it's not enough just to tell them this. They maybe even know it. The question is, how are they going to acknowledge that and change course without losing faith?
Wow, this is amazing. The ego is important, without doubt, we all know that. But it's the all-driving force in most situations. That's something we don't want to recognize, but it is. So you're saying that the need not to lose face, like in Satham's case as well, or there's so many examples, but this is an incredible example. So not to lose face, which means, does it make sense to say, well, you know what, I'm not going to let my ego come in between this deal, and this is something I can give without destroying any value, and I can give to my partner, and if that partner feels happier by doing so, so be it. Is that something you would advocate?
Yeah, so I would advocate it in two ways. So let's take the exact same thing you said and think about the value that it might have in two ways of either getting the deal done or helping people de-escalate. One, if there's something that is not that important to me, but it is important to my negotiation partner, I should be willing to concede on that anyway. Not just because I'm a nice guy, but I might be able to use that concession in exchange for things I actually do care about. So understanding what you care about less and which might be of relatively more value to the other side is generally a good idea, even if you're not in a situation where there's a lot of conflict or emotion. If you can give away things that are relatively cheap for you, you might be able to extract concessions or at least goodwill in exchange.
Right.
The other place this principle comes into play is sometimes it really is just about one thing, and you're arguing over something that only one of you is going to win. All right, there's just one issue everybody's thinking about. There's only one issue that's going to determine who got a better deal. In those cases, sometimes it's useful to think about whether you can add other issues, even if they're only symbolic in nature, that helps the other side give up on the one issue that you need them to give up on. Because if there's only one thing you're fighting over, one of you is going to be a winner and one of you is going to be a loser.
Right.
If you can add additional issues, and sometimes they're just symbolic because the other side knows they're going to have to concede anyway, This allows them to say, well, at least we got the following in exchange. And this is not about manipulating them or tricking them. It's just about making it easier for people to do the difficult things they know they need to do anyway. It's helping them make the decisions that they need to make, which are not easy to make, either because themselves, it's their own ego, or it's because their own audience. Maybe it's the people that they need to report to. Maybe it's their constituents. Maybe it's their board. How are they going to make sure they don't lose face in front of them when they make the courageous decision they need to end the conflict or to do the deal?
I don't know if you know of or remember, Jack Welch was trying to acquire a huge corporation. I forget which one it was. And this is seen sometimes as a blemish on his career when he backed off of that deal. And but eventually now people talk about and say, well, that was a very courageous decision to make because it was destroying his ego, but yet at the same time he took it because it was the right decision to make by backing out of that deal. I don't remember what it was, but I just...
No, I don't remember the details of that story either, so I won't be able to speak to it. But this thing that we've now both mentioned, this notion of courage, is not to be underestimated. Because the fact is, you can't always instill courage on the other side of the table, but if you can even walk into negotiations with more courage yourself, you can do a lot of favors to both sides. And courage is often needed when you're making the kinds of decisions that are the right ones, but will not look right in the short run.
Right. So, it seems that, to be a good negotiator, you really, really need to be a good student of human psychology or human behavior. And you need to develop the art and the capabilities and the skills to traverse this minefield, so to speak. And for that, you need to learn how to use languages and tools to better understand people and better deal with them, like, read what's between the lines or behind the words, see what's not being shown. And that's a very difficult thing to do. It's not easy for everybody. And some people are more adept at it, others are not. So what would you recommend in terms of those who want to learn to be better negotiators? What are some of the things they could do? Are there programs that can be used, or you do self-study, or just become more aware? What do you recommend?
Well, as someone who works at an institution of higher learning that likes to sell seats to students, obviously there's certain things that we propose people can do to improve as a negotiator. But beyond that, and beyond the idea of taking a class or reading a book or reflecting deeply on it, there are a handful of things that you can do, I think, immediately that increase your odds of success in a negotiation. One of them, and it's going to seem sort of obvious, but I think people don't do it enough, is preparation. For too many people walking into negotiation, preparation is basically the following. They say to themselves, okay, here's what I know I want or need, and here's 5 or 6 reasons why they should give it to me. Now let me just go in there and throw all 5 or 6 of those reasons at them, and hopefully one of them sticks, and then I get what I want. When in fact, preparation is much more than that. It's not just about understanding what you want and why you want it. It's about understanding the other side. What are their interests?
Right.
What are their constraints? What are the things they can and cannot give you? Where are their hands truly tied, and where do they have more flexibility? What are their alternatives? So really thinking about the other side, and thinking not just about your own when you're preparing, and thinking about all the different ways in which they might be able to reward you or create value for you. The second thing I would say is asking questions. Now you mentioned briefly this notion of understanding people is important and the psychology of it. More specifically, you need to understand the people you're actually dealing with this in the negotiation. Now, I know a lot of people who talk too much in a negotiation. I know almost nobody who asks too many questions in a negotiation. And again, this is because part of our mindset is walking into negotiation. People think negotiation is about debating. It's about convincing someone of something. It's about persuading them. And there's no doubt that persuasion and influence and a little bit of ability to debate are relevant to your set of negotiation skills, but in many ways they're just the tip of the iceberg. What you really want to understand is, why is this person here today? What keeps them up at night? Why are they doing this deal today, not a week from now or 6 months ago? Who are the other parties they might be talking to? What makes them different from all the other people you've negotiated similar deals with? What do they care about more? What do they care about less? Is their alternative getting better or worse as time goes on? And they won't answer every question you ask, but they're much more likely to answer a question if you ask it than if you don't. And so increasing the number of questions you ask can be crucial. Another thing which I devote a lot of time to in negotiating the impossible is this notion of process and negotiating process before substance. Again, too often we walk into the negotiation consumed by what's going to be in the deal and not thinking enough about how we're going to get from where we are today to the finish line. Right. And I'll give you a simple example of this. You've been negotiating a deal for months. You're finally at a point where you think you can get the deal done. You have a couple of concessions that you've been saving up for a moment like this. And they're a little bit costly to you, but you throw them out there to seal the deal.
Right.
And the other side looks at you and says, thank you, this is great, we really appreciate this. Now let me just go talk to my boss and see what she thinks about it. And you're sitting there going, wait a second, you have a boss? I thought this was it. I got nothing more to give. This is a failure of not having negotiated process before negotiating substance. Process is asking questions like, what does it take for an organization like yours to get from where we are today to a deal? Who are all the parties that need to say yes? What are factors that might speed it up? What are things that might slow it down? How are we going to measure success? How are we going to make sure the deal is implemented in the appropriate way? The more you focus on process up front, the less likely you make mistakes on substance later on. And so again, these are some of the pieces, and there's many more things that you can do. But if you start asking more questions, if you're a little bit more prepared, not just about your side but their side, if you focus not just on the substance but on the process, you're likely to get a better deal. And then the book gets into many more things.
Right. This is so tricky, and it's important for me to point it out right now. We're talking about seeing them as partners, yet some of the things that you're talking about remind me, or would remind any listener, of almost a war-like footing where your counterintelligence is important, where your preparation is important, because you don't know, there's a lot of deception out there, there's a lot of misinformation out there, subterfuges and all kinds of complexities. So while you treat them as I wouldn't use the word pretend, because you need to genuinely change your mindset and say you treat them as partners, but you at the same time recognize that at this point in time they are seeing maybe as adversary. They may be seeing you as an adversary. So
that's right. So what we don't try to do with a book like this is pretend the world is a better place than it actually is. We take the world as given and say, are there ways we can interact with it in a more effective fashion?
Right.
And so in the book, even though it's aimed in large part towards your readers, towards people negotiating business deals, what I do throughout the book is put in examples of really war-like negotiations, in fact, war. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is one example. I talk about what happened in the treaty that was signed after World War I and the treaty that was signed after the Napoleonic Wars. Right. I mentioned already the most ancient peace treaty in history. And so it's not just reminding people of war, it's actually important and useful to learn from examples of war, because what that does often for people who are in the world of business is to say, okay, I thought my situation is tough. It's not nuclear brinkmanship tough. So if it's possible to use these principles in that scenario, perhaps I can try and apply these principles to my scenario as well. Not because the people I'm dealing with are nice or want the best for me or are completely ethical. They're behaving in ways that are aggressive or unethical, but that doesn't mean the only solution I have is to go to war.
Right. And it also, so the tricky part is to say, well, I recognize that they are adversarial, but if I treat them as partners, if I consider this situation as a partnership situation, then my behaviors would be guided correctly towards creating a collaborative solution, creating peace, because the goal of war is peace. So you keep, in a sense, you keep your goal clear, that your goal is peace, and once peace is achieved, they are going to be partners. So treat them as such, yet at the same time recognize that they are enemies at the moment, and or could be. Therefore, it's important and imperative that you go and dig in and understand them, because the peace treaty, so to speak, or the peace will be accomplished only if you really understand their situation. And
that last phrase, understand their situation, is a key. So just to be clear, the idea is not, no matter if the fact that they're hurling bombs at you, you should treat them as friends. No, that might actually encourage them to throw more bombs at you if they're really angry. So really what it comes down to is a difference between empathy and sympathy. What we're not suggesting in the book, and I have an entire section here on the power of empathy, truly the power of understanding the perspective of other people. is that understanding is important. You don't need to justify what they're doing. You don't need to nod along or say what they're doing is right. But you do need to understand how do they explain their own behavior to themselves. What justifies it in their mind?
Yeah.
And I think the mistake people make is they think, well, empathy, is relevant in certain situations, when in fact empathy is most relevant and most important when you're dealing with people who seem to deserve it least. It's when people are behaving in ways that seem almost inexplicable to you that your capacity for empathy is most tested and also most important. If you can do that, if you can understand what's driving them, your set of options for solving the problem go up. You still retain the right or the option of fighting or going to war. Nobody's taking that away from you. But sometimes when you figure out what's really driving them, it also creates a few more options that you might actually prefer to going to war or to fighting more aggressively. And that's the key, because the mistake people again make is empathy is something that you do to be a nice person. And from my point of view as a negotiator, empathy is not doing them a favor. Having empathy is doing yourself a favor, because the greater your capacity for empathy, the more options you have for achieving your own objectives.
This is amazing. This is absolutely fantastic, because, it is something similar to when people say forgive somebody for what they've done. That doesn't mean that you condone what they did. That only means that you have not forgotten, but you have given yourself some respite in saying, there were reasons for this person to behave this way because this is the way the person is. If you have a snake in your hand and you consider it as a pet and you treat it as a puppy, chances are you're going to be bitten because snakes.
That's right. That's right. And, I tell a story in the book, in this section on empathy, about a business deal that we were involved with. It was a multi-million-dollar business deal, and it was just not going very, very well. And I can tell you that the turning point came when we decided that, maybe the right thing to do is not to assume that their very aggressive and seemingly unethical behaviors mean that they are irrational or incompetent or evil. That there might be some other explanation why they think it's appropriate to behave this way. And when we went down that path, it did transform the negotiation. No, it didn't in the snap of a finger solve the problem and make us millions of dollars, but it put us on the right track. And then we had to grind it out. Again, I often have to remind my students, they're coming to Harvard, they're not coming to Hogwarts. So they're not going to get a magic wand and suddenly all their problems are gone. But what we can do is teach at the school and also in this book a set of principles and a set of tactics that when you apply make it much more likely that you achieve your goal more efficiently in a way that has better outcomes for everyone.
In a sense, you are developing the ability to predict them because you understand their causal behaviors. And so you say...
That's right. And you can understand what it's going to take for them to change those behaviors. So you can predict what they're going to do, but you can also understand what would it take to get them to stop doing this.
Right.
Or what would it take for them to see the world differently? And again, this doesn't mean that you're going to be able to do it right away. One of the things I talk about in the book, and then I get into some greater depth about, is, one of the things effective negotiators understand is that what's not negotiable today may be negotiable tomorrow.
Right.
What's not possible today may be possible a week, a month, or 3 years from now. And then that raises a question, what do we need to put into place now to make it more likely that we get there a week from now, 6 months from now, or 3 years from now, and we actually can get the deal done?
Yes, absolutely. I completely get it. So this is one of the pillars, the key pillars, the ability to understand the entire situation as well as you possibly can, just like you would in the case of a war, where you would make sure that you know as much as you can possibly know about your engagement partner, whatever you call them. Okay, now, second set of questions are about the idea.
Nick, you're just going to have to start calling them partner. I know you keep trying to hedge. Just say partner. Embrace it.
Right, okay. I'm with you. All right, so the next set of questions are more about how do you project your own self? The psychological frameworks that you're dealing with. And I'm going to bring in the concepts such as the NLP, neural linguistic programming, or things like the NVC, which is considered, what is it called? Nonviolent communication by Marshall Rosenberg or somebody. The way we talk, the way we present ourselves, the way we engage with people so that we make them feel more comfortable, more open, more trusting. And I understand, and I'm making that assumption that trust is the more trust that exists between these two people, partners who are engaging in a negotiation, the better the quality of outcomes. Is that a safe assumption to make?
Yeah. So on this issue of trust, I think it would be accurate to say that the more trust between two parties, the more likely a deal gets done, and the more likely that there is more value in the deal. And let me give you a very simple but I think powerful example of how trust matters, because it sort of seems like, well, of course we want trust. We want trust, we want happiness, we want love, we want chocolate, we want all the good things, and we don't want the bad things. Here's how trust actually operates in negotiation. Imagine you're in a world, like in an economy, where there's no trust, and I want to buy a pair of shoes from you. The only way we can structure that deal is I'm going to show up at your store, you're going to hand me the shoes, and I'm going to hand you cash at the same time. Or maybe not even cash, because maybe we don't even trust cash. Maybe I'd have to hand you something else, like in a bartering situation that might be of value to you. In a world where there's no trust, there's no such thing as credit. There's no such thing as I'll pay you tomorrow. There's no such thing even as potentially cash. And so a lack of trust, what it does in negotiations and deals of all kinds, is it limits the different types of deal structures that are even possible. You're trying to buy a company, you can't have an earn-out structure if you're in a world where there's no trust. You're trying to hire someone, you can't hire someone in any employment setting if you can't contract on every aspect of their behavior if there's no trust. So one of the things that trust helps do is, first, at the earliest stages, it allows people to even come to the table with each other when the deal that they're going to try to structure isn't going to be completely like a cash-on-delivery trade. And then it allows them to structure the deal in lots of ways that wouldn't have been possible if they had to entirely count on the letter of the law and the letter of the contract. And so the greater your capacity to build trust, the more likely you get deals done and the more likely that they're value-creating deals. And I think that NLP and nonverbal behaviors and specific things you say can have an impact, but at least in my experience, the reason people lose trust, the reason trust diminishes sometimes between partners that could otherwise have had trust, is not because somebody does something very untrustworthy and tries to completely take advantage of the other side for a lot of money and now all trust is lost forever. Usually trust gets lost a little at a time. You said you would do something, you didn't follow up on it. You pretended that the deal had to be done in a week, and then when it went past a week, you seemed to still be at the table. People lose trust a little bit at a time by not following through on their word, by not being consistent with what they've said before, because they're taking little shortcuts. They're saying things that are not exactly true to gain a little bit of tactical advantage. They're not stealing money, they're not embezzling, they're not, this is not fraud. But they lose trust because they take these shortcuts. And one of the things I always remind my students and my clients is that we're just never going to do that. What we're not going to do is sacrifice the trust, the goodwill, in order to get short-term advantage. So if we're going to say something, we're going to do it. And in really difficult negotiations, and I advise companies, I also advise governments when they're negotiating with insurgents and terrorist groups, I often remind people that sometimes in the deal, you're going to find yourself in a situation one day where the only asset you have is your credibility. The only reason they're even going to come talk to you or sit down or try and hammer this out or stick with you when things go tough is because they trust you. And it's really going to pay off that way. Now, you should do it anyway because it's the ethical thing to do. But trust is a huge asset, which sometimes pays off really high dividends.
Amazing. Wonderful. Let me, to get greater clarity on this, the hardball negotiation stylists, so to speak, there are books that are talking about that, kill, get your share, whatever whichever words they use. I want to specify that it doesn't mean that to build trust, you need to give in more.
Right. So, what's interesting is, and we study this, when we do deals, we do exercises, simulations in the lab, in the classroom. We often have people negotiate various kinds of deals. And one of the things we ask them at the end of it is not just what deal did you get, but how much do you trust each other? Would you work with this person again, etc. And one of the things I find often is that it is absolutely possible to get a great deal and a great relationship. Or to put it another way, you don't have to pay people to have them like you. And one of the reasons that happens is because in most real-world negotiation situations, like a business deal you're in, at the end of the negotiation, it's not like you get to find out with great precision exactly how much they walked away with, how much money they took home. You know how much you got. You know how much better off you are than getting no deal, but you don't have a good or great sense of how much more you could have really gotten. And in fact, in a lot of negotiations, the other side is trying to convince you that, hey, you pushed us to the limit, you got a great deal, etc. So people walk away from a negotiation not having great clarity and having only at best a noisy signal of how good the deal was for the other side. And so when people are thinking about whether they liked the negotiation, whether they like the partner they negotiated with, whether they trust them, whether they want to work with them in the future, instead of looking at how good of a deal did I get, one of the things they put a lot of weight on is how did this process unfold? And they use elements of process as a proxy for was this a good negotiation. And these are things like, did the negotiation last as long as it should have? Or did it drag on too long or end too quickly? It's things like, did the other side let me speak, or were they always, cutting in, butting in, or speaking and not letting me say my perspective?
Right.
Did both sides move from their opening positions? Did there seem to be equal give and take in the conversation? And these are all things that are not the same as what outcome you got versus what they got. These are proxies. These are process elements that people weight heavily to decide whether or not they were treated fairly. Did you fight me on every little issue, or did you acknowledge that there's some things I care about more than you? And so what you can do as a negotiator is, yes, fight for the things that you think are important to you. Try to get the best deal you can within, bounds of ethics and reasonableness, but also manage the process, because managing the process in an appropriate way allows them to feel even better about the deal.
Because ultimately it's all about feelings. We should recognize as humans, we don't want to. We often say, well, numbers-based and rationality and all that. But within certain parameters, there are triggers. There are ways our minds are wired, and they produce certain effects. And understanding what those effects are, no matter what, like $9.99, it's not the same thing as $10. It will never be. Or 75% off. Everybody knows what the truth is, but it doesn't matter what you know. There are those psychological triggers that make you feel a certain way. And recognizing what behaviors affect and influence other people's feelings becomes important. Is that something that you also encourage and teach, that you need?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, very early in the book, I don't know if it's in the preface or in the intro, one of the things I do is I take a few moments to describe what I think negotiation is and what it's about, to define it. And I start out by saying that, again, having negotiated deals and advised on deals in million and billion-dollar business contacts, when you're negotiating ceasefires between governments and insurgent groups, or you're trying to negotiate a litigation, the thing that I point out in the book is that, at least in my experience, negotiation isn't about dollars and cents. It's not about lives lost or lives saved. It's not about the stopping of bullets. It's not about emotions. It's not about any one thing. It's not about any one currency. Negotiation, regardless of which context you find yourself in, is always fundamentally about human interaction. And the question we're always trying to answer in negotiation, regardless of the context, whether you're negotiating a job offer, a strategic deal, a ceasefire, the question we're always trying to answer in negotiation is, how can we engage with other human beings in such a way as to achieve better understandings and better agreements? It doesn't matter if the agreement's going to be written down on a piece of paper. The problem we're always trying to solve in negotiation is, how do we engage with other human beings in a way that allows us to achieve better understandings and better agreements? And that's where what you were talking about, the psychology of it, the understanding of human beings. If you're dealing with human beings, what could be more important than trying to understand them?
Right.
That has to be the first step.
Right. So there are all kinds of people. We the people, so to speak, look alike. But sometimes the way I look at things is, there's a rat person, there's a snake person, there's a tiger person, there's a cow person, personalities. You don't see them, but people are all different. And sometimes you're dealing with very aggressive, even unethical, uh, sociopathic people in the business world, right?
Mhm.
What do you have to say about that? How do you change your approach in negotiation if you're dealing with sociopaths? Which, by the way, 4% people are sociopaths, but 40% CEOs are sociopaths.
Well,
Some numbers.
I'm not sure if that percentage is accurate. There may be some good rigorous study on that. Um, in most business deals, and having done just scores and scores of business deals at all levels with, as you have, lots of different personalities, I can tell you it's very, very easy to sort of take one label, like sociopath or like unethical or a snake or whatever it is that you want to say, and use that as a way of thinking about everything that the other side is doing. But in fact, the other side is as complicated a person as you are. I don't think any one of us would acknowledge that there's any one label that would explain all of our behaviors. But it's very easy to do that about the people on the other side of the table. And so what you want to do is, sure, keep your guard up if you think they have sociopathic tendencies. Keep your guard up if you know, based on experience with them or their reputation, that they have no compunction lying to you. Absolutely keep your guard up, but don't lose sight of the fact that they are also a human being that has many drives, many things that might be motivating them, including standard psychological biases that you might be able to predict, including the fact that they probably don't want to lose face, including the fact that, there's probably some issues they care about more and some issues they care about less, including the fact that they also don't want a bad deal. So if their alternatives are getting worse, that might give you leverage. So there's all these other things that we can use in the negotiation to achieve better outcomes, even with, quote, those people. But we will not do those effectively if we think too narrowly about who they are. And this is something that doesn't just happen between individuals, it happens between groups. One of the long-standing sort of psychological phenomena between groups is that we think of ourselves, our group, as being very, very heterogeneous, but out groups as being all the same. It's that same mentality that can get stuck in these kinds of negotiations, and it limits our own options.
That is true. Keeping that kind of sanity where you don't have a single view of the truth, rather be open to multiple perspectives, and it's hard to do. This is all the things that you're saying is counterintuitive to people's instincts, and that's why it takes effort to really get to that point.
Well, it's called negotiating the impossible, and I think, as you're pointing out, one of the things that we're doing when we're negotiating effectively is we're also changing the way in which we approach the world. It's not just about what are the tactics I'm going to use to deal with a person X who I'm seeing across the table. It's what kind of person am I going to be bringing into the negotiation on my side of the table. And, the nice thing is, the good thing is, although we can't become a totally different person overnight, at least what we try to do in the book is give tangible things that you can start doing right away, which if you do over and over again, not only will give you lots of benefits in the short run, but may end up changing the way in which you engage with human beings in general. If you make a habit of asking more questions in negotiations, you're going to get a lot of, auxiliary benefits of this. You're going to become a more empathetic person. You're going to be better at understanding not just the people you're negotiating with in business, but people in your life. And slowly, you will probably have a different style. For example, my style is not to walk into a negotiation, slam my fist on the table, get all aggressive and loud. But I understand that it's other people's approach sometimes, so I need to know how to deal with it, but I also want to reflect on how it is that I want to negotiate.
That's true, absolutely. I mean, these are learned traits. The simple approach you can change of yourself, anyone, and I'm talking about myself in particular. When people ask questions, you tend to respond. Most people will tend to respond directly, give a direct answer to the direct question, and many times that's the right thing to do. If your boss asks you a direct question, give a direct response. But oftentimes it also makes sense to learn the art of asking how, why, when, and where to really get at what the real question is. And in dealing with my kids, I've got 3 daughters, and I'm a single parent now. I am learning through the fire hose. It's hard. They're teaching me so much about engaging with people, and the fact that I need to have a repository of how and why. Because the moment I go anywhere else, it becomes treacherous. If I stick with how and why, life tends to be easier. So I
Yep.
completely get that. I want to ask you one last question.
Yep.
Selling versus negotiation.
hmm
I know sales is always going to end up as a negotiation, but is negotiation a subset of selling, or can this be seen as one and the same thing?
I would say option C. So I wouldn't say negotiation is a subset of selling. I would say selling is a subset of negotiation. And here's what I mean by that. See, you started out by thinking about sales as something people do in the world. I have to sell products or services or yourself. And part of how I'm going to do that is by negotiating effectively. But I see the world in a different way, because negotiation is the higher level construct. Negotiation is about how we engage with people who see the world differently than we do in order to achieve some sort of agreement or understanding. In that world, selling, whether it's your ideas, your preferred approach, a deal structure, a proposal, that might be a part of it. How do I convince them? How do I persuade them? How do I get them to be attracted to this point of view? But there's so much more to negotiation than just selling. And as we've talked about, it's about empathy. It's about thinking about process. It's about thinking about how they're going to declare victory, et cetera, et cetera. So in my world, someone who is a negotiator, who sees the world through a negotiation lens, and who thinks that people can benefit from seeing the world through a negotiation lens, where negotiation is a good word, selling is but a small part of it. But I can imagine someone who identifies with the notion of being a salesperson, for them negotiation would be one of their tools. But then they're thinking of negotiation in a smaller way than I try to get people to do with this book.
Excellent. This is wonderful. I am so glad I got an opportunity to talk with you, Deepak. And I have tons of other questions, as you probably can imagine in our conversation. You realize that. But I think we've touched upon a lot of important stuff here. And
Great. It was wonderful talking to you. And as much as I talk about negotiation all the time, we don't always get a chance to dig so deeply into these ideas, into these constructs. So it's kind of nice to do that.
Thank you. Thank you. That's what I had aimed to do, is to go deeper rather than touch upon it superficially. Wonderful.
Good. All right. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Deepak.